first of all, there's much talk from people in the SNP, you and Nicola Sturgeon, about how the British government is obliged to consider your proposals that you're about to publish. But what does that mean? Are you saying they have to keep either Britain or Scotland in the single market, or that's a breach of their obligations?
Well, that's certainly the First Minister's view in Nicola Sturgeon's proposal. And of course, things look like they're turning in that direction a bit. I mean, the opinion poll this morning, for the first time, showed people across the UK giving priority over the single marketplace and control of immigration. In Scotland, of course, it's massive. It's more than 2 to 1 in that poll this morning. So there's still an element of pressure there to try and force that position on the government. But whatever happens in terms of the UK, the First Minister will be clear this week how Scotland can remain within the single market, remain prosperous and have that economic advantage that it would be foolhardy to give up.
But I'm curious about all the talk of another independence referendum if the Scottish Government doesn't get some sort of deal. I mean, for you, is that the red line, that Scotland, one way or another, would have to be in the single market, or else there'll be another independence referendum?
Well, what matters is what Nicola Sturgeon's red lines are, and I think what she's enunciated is a simple 1, 2, 3, Gordon. 1, keep the UK within the single marketplace and fight that fight. Secondly, if that's not possible, keep Scotland within the single marketplace. And if that doesn't happen, if the UK is unwilling to listen to Scotland's representations and our proposals, then it's very likely, as Nicola Sturgeon put it, there'll be an independence referendum within the next 2 years.
But I'm curious as to whether you see that as the red line, because there could potentially be all sorts of other deals, for example, repatriation of powers from the European Union to the Scottish Parliament, where the British government could say, well, look, we've given you lots, but are you saying it's the single market that has to be the red line?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon has put forward her priorities, let's call them that. That's staying in the single market, proper and equal treatment for other Europeans, and the rights of Scottish workers, the protections which are currently bestowed by European legislation. I'm sure in the strategy document that's to be published this week, she'll be outlining a range of other things that Scotland requires, particularly in the powers that we will need in order to secure Scotland's position. Of course, there are certain powers, as you're well aware, for example, fishing, agriculture, but also some control of immigration that would be required within the single marketplace for Scotland to operate within it, as well as obviously the full powers of Scottish independence.
But again, I don't understand that. Are you saying that Scotland having control of a fisheries policy, for example, that would do as a compromise? Because that seems to be the opposite of staying in the single market. I mean, you could imagine Scotland getting all sorts of powers by breaking away from the European Union. But are you saying, no, being in the single market is the main thing?
Well, I'm sorry, it's not the opposite of being in the single market. We just need to glance across the North Sea, and I'm not very far from it, where I'm this now, Gordon, to see a country called Norway, which is within the single marketplace, but has powers over its fishing industry. Of course, as we saw this week, I mean, fishing is very interesting, Gordon, because it's probably the sole real industry in the recent referendum, in the European referendum, which was in favour of exiting the European Union. But of course, as we saw from the House of Lords report this week, fishing depends on access to the single marketplace in order to sell our fish products. I mean, you know, it'd be great if we get 20% more quota, but if there's a 20% tax on our fish products across Europe, then any advantage we have from that will quickly be dissipated and fishermen would be the losers. So that's why the single marketplace is important to every aspect of the Scottish economy, including the fishing industry.
Do you think you could win an independence referendum at the moment?
Yes.
Why?
Well, as I pointed out before, last time when I was First Minister and embarked on this process, and the support for independence was 28%. After 2 years, that was 2012, we ended up at 45%. So I don't think Nicola Sturgeon would have any compunction about calling an independence referendum with support in the mid-40s. What it depends on is the arguments. And in a situation where the United Kingdom government was determined, despite given every opportunity to sever Scotland's European links, to sever our ties as a 1,000-year-old European nation, then I think that would bring many people who were previously sceptical about independence onto the yes side.
And you think you would win?
Yes, I do.
The polls at the moment show, I take your point about at the beginning of the last campaign, support for independence was much lower. The argument against that is that because of the last campaign, people have made up their minds. That there's not 20% of people floating around who don't have a view one way or another. Therefore, it would be much more difficult to win, to get you over the line.
Oh, I think there's a lot of people with an open mind about Scottish independence. I mean, I think there are people who are passionately in favour, there are people who are strongly against, but there's still lots of folk in Scotland who would regard Scotland's prosperity, securing Scotland's position as a European nation, the rights of Scottish workers, the equal treatment of our fellow Europeans, access to the single marketplace as a member, as key priorities, which, if they could only be maintained and claimed by independence, could be persuaded to vote in that direction, with careful argument and all the powers of persuasion that Nicola Sturgeon has over the next 2 years.
The other problem that the SNP might have is that not only do the polls show that a majority of people want to stay in the UK, at least at the moment, they also show a majority of people have no appetite for having another referendum.
Yeah, and they also show, as I mentioned in the opinion poll this morning, that more than 2/3 of Scots want to maintain the position in the single marketplace and put that and jobs and prosperity above the control of immigration, which seems to be the priority of the UK government. So what we're seeing is a variety of indications, but a clarion call for Scotland to make its way as a European nation in the absence of any alternative to secure that position, I think would be a strong position to debate the independence issue to come. But we have to take this in stages. Nicola Sturgeon, I think quite correctly, has said, look, we want the UK to stay within the single marketplace and with the other protections. If that's not possible, we're publishing a strategy which shows how Scotland could do that. And if the UK government says, oh, we're not interested in what Scotland has to say, if they have a Philip Hammond type of attitude as opposed to Theresa May's initial words on this, then of course we'd be in a different context and I think in a strong position to have that independence campaign.
But if the British government turns around to the Scottish government and says, look, we're not going to stay in the single market, or we're not in the way you want. However, you, the Scottish government, have talked about wanting more powers. What powers is it you want? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon talked in general terms about this. There's been much talk about it. What powers do you want as a result of Brexit?
Well, I think as someone who conscientiously reads up on these things, if you wait this week and see the strategy document that Nicola's publishing, you know, the first strategy to emerge from any political leader in these islands, then I think you'll find these questions answered in full and elucidated in full in that document, in enormous detail, I suspect, if I know Nicola Sturgeon.
All right, Luke, the sun's coming up over your bridge, so we better leave you to it.
Yes, well, it's a happy Christmas from Strichen and from the northeast of Scotland, Gordon.